I just got a question from my friend Justin, who asked a question about Protestant theology. The question is essentially, how is it that Protestants can justify the removal of, well, some call the Apocrypha or the deuterocanonical books of the Old Testament? That would be those books that are included in the Catholic Bible that are not included in many Protestant translations. The easy answer to that would be they generally don't even bother talking about it. I've been in seminary for a number of years now, and also received my bachelor's degree while studying at two different Christian universities, and the subject of the quote-unquote Apocrypha has maybe come up once or twice and was dealt with very swiftly and without a whole lot of depth. That's not to say there isn't a lot of Protestant thinking that has gone into it, but most Protestants, even pastors, are completely uneducated on the issue. If you were going to evaluate how a Protestant would go about defending these books, or the removal of these books, you would probably go to a couple places. Now, Justin mentioned Martin Luther, and Martin Luther was partially responsible for this, but I would say that his treatment of those books is very different than the current treatment. And if Luther saw the way those books were treated today within the Protestant world, I think he'd be pretty appalled. Luther pointed to those books as a great source of inspiration and used them in services, included them as liturgical texts, and generally had a very high regard for them. What has happened since Luther has been very interesting. A lot of it comes from, well, what we would call more the radical Reformation side of things. The books, over time, ceased to be published in Bibles, but that was not originally the case. The original King James included those Bibles. The original Luther Bible, or included those books. The original Luther Bible also included those books. They stopped being included as people began to have certain arguments against them that weren't quite right. A lot of it was a reaction against Catholicism, and some people viewed those books as the primary way that Catholics defended certain doctrines, and so they were a little bit afraid of them. They didn't want people to be influenced by them. There does seem to be some indication that things like prayer to saints, for example, is biblical if you use the deuterocanonical books. So there is that sort of prejudicial movement away from it, and the radical Reformation tended to ostracize anything that looked too Catholic or that they couldn't find in Scripture, because Scripture was such a focus point. They had to hone in on what actually is Scripture. And so then you get into sort of why they removed those books in the first place. There was a huge concern within Protestantism of getting back to the sources. They wanted to be connected to the origins of Christianity, to the heart of Christianity, to the writings of the apostles. And in order to get back to the Scriptures, they did a number of things. One of those things was trying to read the text in the original languages. This is part of a broader cultural movement at the time, where people were returning to original texts in a lot of different fields, and Catholics were doing the same thing too. That's part of the reason that the Reformation happened in the first place, was this broader cultural movement to return to the sources. Erasmus, for example, created a text that was kind of a new Greek text based on the most up-to-date scholarship at the time, and it was really a monumental project that influenced Luther and many other reformers in a major way. But in doing that, they began to notice certain things, and those things became more important to them. One of those things was many of the texts in the Old Testament were not written in Hebrew. Now, the Old Testament at this point had never been officially canonized. Generally speaking, the church had used a text called the Septuagint, which was the ancient Greek translation of the Old Testament. And the Septuagint included some books that were either never written in Hebrew or that people at the time of the Reformation did not have access to in Hebrew. So they began to think, well, we're trying to get back to the sources. Why aren't these texts in Hebrew? And in looking at some writings, there seemed to be an aversion towards some of these Greek Old Testament texts. You could see in the writings of Augustine a bit of an aversion against those. You could see in the writings of Jerome a bit of an aversion against those things. Some of the key Latin fathers within the Catholic Church. So Luther took hold of some of these writings and also looked at the sort of hypothetical Council of Jamnia, in which the Jewish canon of Scripture was defined, which historically would have been an anti-Christian council. So I find it interesting that Jamnia is often used as an argument for the exclusion of these apocryphal or deuterocanonical books. But they looked to these sources and decided that the books didn't sort of match their source critical criteria, essentially. But they were still good books. They should still be read, and they should still be used in church. I think it's a tragedy that tendency was abandoned, especially here in the United States with our tendency towards revivalism. Now, there are some movements back within certain sectors of Protestantism towards using these books. I can think of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod is currently in the process of creating an edition of the deuterocanonical books, the Apocrypha, that includes study notes similar to their study Bible. And I think this is a very exciting sort of transition, and there's been discussion of including them once again in Protestant lectionaries, and I think that's pretty exciting as well. In fact, I have a copy of a Lutheran service book that was published by a Lutheran pastor last year, which includes them as part of the lectionary. So there are some strides being made towards their inclusion. And as you can probably tell from this video, I personally love those books, and I don't think the Protestant Reformation treated them with the dignity that they deserved. So I hope to once again see them more and more in translations, and more we are seeing it happen. There are Catholic editions and all other editions of the scriptures that include these books and most of the modern translations that are coming out. So I hope that trend continues, and I hope that everyone's Bibles will get a little bit thicker in the years to come. Alright, I gotta get back to watching the road. Signing off, Billy Kangas.